A mysterious illness tormented the millionaire's son. His hands shook uncontrollably, making even the simplest tasks, like holding a glass of water, impossible. The best doctors in the world, with all the technology available, failed to find the cause or a cure. The father, a man who built an empire, felt completely powerless. Then, a new and humble cleaner, a woman with a gentle smile, was hired. No one expected anything from her. Then, one day, the millionaire came home early from work. From the doorway, he saw a scene in the garden that made him collapse. His son, the boy who could barely hold a fork, was carefully removing a small wooden block from the middle of a tall and unstable Jenga tower with a precision and steadiness in his hands that defied logic and medicine. Richard's empire was crumbling in the reflection of a glass of water. From his office, a sanctuary of glass and steel overlooking Manhattan, the city he dominated, he watched his 10-year-old son, Daniel, on the high-definition screen that streamed feeds from the entire mansion. The boy was sitting at the kitchen table, his hand hovering over the glass, a hesitation that tore through Richard's chest with the precision of shrapnel. Then the tremor began. Subtle at first, an almost imperceptible vibration, but it grew in waves, shaking the small hand until the water became a small tsunami inside the glass, spilling onto the flawless marble tabletop. Daniel's shoulders slumped, a turtle retreating into the shell of his own shame without making a single sound. The silence was worse than any cry. Richard closed his eyes. He, who could move the stock market with a single call, who had turned a small amount of seed money into an incalculable fortune, who possessed a net worth in dollars that many countries would envy, felt like the most fragile and powerless of men. His businesses, his assets, his high-yield investments were worthless in the face of that tremor. He could predict the fluctuation of a rare cryptocurrency, but he couldn't predict when his own heir's hand would betray him. Ever since his wife, Laura, was gone, Daniel's grief had found a way to manifest physically, a cruel language that no expert had been able to decipher. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Albright, a woman whose rigidity mirrored the architecture of the house, entered the kitchen with firm steps, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval at the sight of the puddle. "Daniel, we've talked about this. Focus. The occupational therapist will arrive in 20 minutes. She wasn't cruel, just terribly efficient. And her efficiency was a form of torture. She represented the legion of doctors, therapists, and specialists who had passed through that house, each with a new theory, a new technique, a new exorbitant cost, but all with the same result: failure. Richard turned off the screen, the image of his son's defeated face seared into his mind. Money bought the best, but the best weren't good enough. The loneliness of that house was a suffocating luxury. Every hallway echoed with the absence of laughter, every room a reminder of what his vast wealth could not fill. Just then, his personal phone rang. It was Mrs. Albright. "Sir," she said, in her usual formal tone, "the agency has sent the new cleaner. She's waiting at the service entrance." Richard sighed. Another anonymous cog in the machine of his perfectly managed life. Let her in and give her the instructions. He was about to hang up when something compelled him to add, "I'll speak with her myself. Send her to the main hall." Mrs. Albright hesitated, the break in protocol momentarily flustering her, but she only said, "Yes, sir." Minutes later, Richard descended the marble staircase that curved like the spine of a white dinosaur, and he saw her. Standing in the center of the vast hall, under the crystal chandelier worth more than a city block in her neighborhood, was a woman of simple appearance. She wore a modest uniform, but her posture was serene. Her eyes didn't wander over the surrounding opulence, showing neither intimidation nor awe. They simply saw him, and in her gaze was a calm that seemed out of place in this palace of tension. She didn't shrink under his scrutiny. She just waited, a quiet presence in the midst of his gilded chaos. And For the first time in many months, Richard felt something other than pain and frustration, a nagging, almost irritating curiosity. Who was this woman who dared to bring peace into his war? Helena received her instructions from Mrs. Albright the next day, a tour of the mansion that felt more like a military inspection. The head housekeeper pointed to glass and metal surfaces with the tip of a gloved finger, listing the specific cleaning products for each, the exact times each room was to be touched, and most importantly, the areas that were strictly off-limits. Daniel's room was a therapy sanctuary that was only to be cleaned in his absence, and the master's office was sacred territory. Helena just nodded, her silence interpreted by Mrs. Albright as the submission of a subordinate and not as what it really was, keen observation. What Helena noticed wasn't the opulence, the art collection, or the designer furniture worth a fortune. She noticed the absence of life. The house didn't smell of food, of flowers, of people. It smelled of disinfectant and loneliness. There wasn't a book out of place, a shoe in the hall, a child's drawing stuck to the refrigerator door. It was a museum, not a home. And at the center of this silent museum was the saddest exhibit, the boy, Daniel. In that first week, Helena saw him only in glimpses, a small, hunched figure disappearing down hallways. But she heard him. She heard the frustrated sound of the piano, dissonant notes that sounded like sobs, followed by the click of Mrs. Albright's metronome, relentless as the beat of a metal heart. She heard the scratching of a pencil on paper, a tense sound, followed by a deep sigh and the crumpling of a page. They were the sounds of failure, repeated daily like a ritual of self-flagellation. Richard, from his office, heard it too, between a call to his brokers on Wall Street and an analysis of the volatile crypto market. He would activate the audio feed from his son's room. The sound of Daniel's failure was the soundtrack to his own monumental profits. Every new digit added to his net worth seemed to amplify the echo of the boy's suffering. His possessions, his financial assets, it all felt like a sick joke. He was building a legacy for an inheritance of trembling hands. The breaking point for Helena came on Thursday. She was polishing the staircase banister when the door to Daniel's room opened. The boy came out, his eyes red and his face stained with silent tears. He didn't see her. He passed her like a small ghost and headed for the garden. Right behind him, Mrs. Albright emerged, holding a penmanship workbook. "Stubbornness will get you nowhere, Daniel," she said, her voice intended to be firm, but sounding only cold. Helena glanced at the page in the book. The letter A was repeated dozens of times. The first ones were shaky. The last were angry smudges that had torn through the paper. In that moment, Helena didn't see a problem with motor coordination. She saw a cry for help. The next day, Friday, she arrived early. In her bag, between her lunch and her wallet, was an object that did not belong in this world of luxury and technology. It was a worn cardboard box with a picture of a wooden block tower. It was a simple Jenga set from her own home, one that her now-grown son had loved so much. At the end of her shift, when the house was steeped in the quiet that preceded the master's return, and with Mrs. Albright busy in her own office, Helena slipped silently into Daniel's room. She didn't set up the tower, didn't leave it prominently on the desk. She just placed the closed box in a corner, behind an armchair, almost hidden. It wasn't an instruction, nor was it therapy. It was a silent invitation, a door left ajar in a hallway of orders and expectations. The first turning point happened in an almost sacred silence, far from judging eyes and therapeutic agendas. Richard was in his sanctuary, closing a stock deal that would increase his already vast fortune by another few million. The chart on his screen showed an upward curve of profit, but his eyes were fixed on the small video window in the corner of his monitor, the live feed from Daniel's room. The boy was supposed to be with his occupational therapist, but the session had been cancelled. Richard had expected to find him listless, staring at the wall, as he always did during moments of forced idleness. But Daniel wasn't on his bed. He was on the floor, in a corner of the room, with the cardboard box Richard didn't recognize. With a curiosity that overrode his instinct to call Mrs. Albright and ask what this strange object was, he zoomed in. The boy took the wooden blocks out of the box. They were simple, rectangular, with no vibrant colors or electronic components. Daniel looked at them for a long time, then began to stack them, forming a small, clumsy tower. Then he stopped. His hand hovered in the air, and Richard held his breath. This was the test. The boy tried to pull a block from the base. The tremor began, light, then more intense. The tower wobbled for a second and collapsed with a soft clatter of wood. Richard leaned back in his chair, his heart sinking, expecting the burst of frustration, the muffled sob, the angry gesture of sweeping the pieces away. But none of that happened. Daniel looked at the scattered blocks, and on his face there was no defeat, only deep concentration. He simply began to rebuild the tower. Once, twice, 3 times. The tower fell, and he rebuilt it, each time with a sigh, but without tears. Richard felt a knot form in his throat. It was the first time he had seen his son persist in the face of failure. The absence of pressure, of an adult correcting him, seemed to have changed the equation. The next day, the tension in the house became palpable. Mrs. Albright, during her inspection rounds, saw the cardboard box in the corner. "What is this?" she asked Helena, who was cleaning the windows. Her voice was sharp. "It's just a game, Mum," Helena replied with her usual calm. "This boy needs treatment, not distractions. The investment Mr. Richard makes in his recovery is astronomical. I will not have trinkets brought from the outside interfering with his progress. Remove this at once." Helena didn't argue. She just nodded. Later, however, when cleaning Daniel's room, she saw the blocks scattered again. With the patience of an artisan, she didn't put them back in the box. She rebuilt the initial tower, leaving it standing on the rug, a silent invitation for another attempt. It was a small act of rebellion, a bet on intuition against science. That evening, Richard ignored the reports on his hedge funds and the price of gold. His attention was entirely on the screen. Daniel approached the tower Helena had left. He knelt, his body tense with concentration. His hand moved slowly, with a deliberation Richard had never seen before. His fingers were millimeters from touching a wooden block. In that instant of silence and expectation, a motion sensor alert flashed on the screen. The hallway camera showed Mrs. Albright's austere figure marching toward the room, her face a mask of purpose. The handle on Daniel's door began to turn. The door opened with a soft click, but to Daniel it sounded like a thunderclap. He flinched instantly, the hand that had been a millimeter from the wooden tower clenching in a violent spasm. The tremor, which had quieted to a whisper of concentration, returned with the fury of a startled animal. The entire tower shook in sympathy and, with a dry, desolate sound, collapsed onto the rug. Mrs. Albright stood in the doorway, her face a mask of glacial disapproval. "Daniel, what is the meaning of this mess? Your music therapy session begins in 15 minutes. She didn't wait for an answer. Her eyes swept the room and landed on the scattered blocks, identifying the source of the transgression. In his office, Richard saw it all in high definition. He saw the exact moment the hope on his son's face dissolved, replaced by the familiar mask of shame. He saw the boy's hand tremble, not from the difficulty of the task, but from the simple weight of the housekeeper's gaze. A wave of silent fury rose in his chest, so intense that he clenched his fists on the mahogany desk. All his business acumen, all his skill at reading people and markets seemed useless. He was a master at calculating the risk of an investment, but he had failed to see the emotional liability his own home represented for his son. Mrs. Albright stepped into the room, gathered the wooden blocks with brusque efficiency, and put them back in the box, as if she were handling evidence from a crime scene. "This will stay with me. We need to focus on what the specialists recommend, not on games." She tucked the box under her arm and left, leaving Daniel alone amid the wreckage of his small victory. Later that day, the inevitable confrontation happened in the kitchen. Mrs. Albright cornered Helena near the pantry. "You have overstepped a boundary," the housekeeper said, her voice low but sharp as glass. "I have 20 years of service in this house. I watched Mr. Richard build this empire from nothing. I know what he values: results, discipline. His fortune was built on logical decisions, not on cheap sentimentality." Helena was drying a glass, her movement still calm, but her eyes met Mrs. Albright's in the reflection of a steel cabinet. "I only saw a sad little boy," Helena replied, her voice soft, "and I thought he might like a game." "Like?" Mrs. Albright let out a short, humorless laugh. "Our goal is not for him to like things. It is for him to be cured, a cure that costs the master a small fortune every month. Your childish actions undermine the authority of the therapists and my own. You are confusing your role. You are a cleaner, not a psychologist. Sometimes," Helena placed the glass down carefully, "a cure doesn't come in a prescription. It comes in the permission to be a child." Mrs. Albright drew herself up, offense etched on her face. To her, this was insubordination of the worst kind. She didn't see empathy. She saw a threat to her position, to her control. "We will see about that," she said with grim finality. "Mr. Richard needs to be made aware of this initiative of yours. He is a man who understands assets and liabilities. We'll see which column he puts your interference in." With that, Mrs. Albright turned and marched out of the kitchen, her shoes echoing on the marble floor with a frightening determination. Her steps were firm and direct, heading for the west wing of the mansion toward Richard's office. Richard heard the knock on his office door, sharp and authoritative. "Come in," he said, already knowing who it was and what was coming. Mrs. Albright entered, holding the Jenga box as if it were a dangerous artifact. She placed it on the vast mahogany desk, between a Bloomberg terminal and a stack of investment fund reports. The simple cardboard object looked absurdly out of place in this center of financial power. "Mr. Richard," she began, her voice thick with restrained indignation, "I must bring a serious matter to your attention. This thing was introduced into Daniel's room by the new employee, Helena." Richard remained silent, his chin resting on his hands, his eyes fixed on the housekeeper. He let her build her case, like a seasoned lawyer, allowing an opposing witness to become entangled in their own words. "This woman, with all due respect, is acting outside of her duties. She is encouraging distraction and undermining the therapeutic regimen that renowned specialists, paid with your money, have designed. The boy is attaching himself to this childish game to the detriment of his penmanship and piano sessions, which are essential for his recovery." She paused, expecting a reaction, an agreement, but Richard just watched her, his face unreadable, emboldened by his silence, which she mistook for approval. Mrs. Albright pressed on, her tone sharpening. "Her attitude is one of insubordination. She defied my direct orders to remove the game. This creates a breakdown of discipline in the house. You built your fortune on order and control. Allow me to restore that order. I believe her actions warrant immediate dismissal." Finally, Richard moved. He didn't look at Mrs. Albright. His eyes went to the small screen in the corner of his monitor. Daniel was in his room, sitting on his bed, his hands still in his lap. But his gaze was fixed on the corner where the box had been, an expression of loss so profound it hurt Richard physically. He had seen that same expression on his son's face only once before, the day he told him his mother wasn't coming home. Richard then leaned forward and pulled the Jenga box toward him. He opened it and poured the wooden blocks onto his desk, their soft clatter contrasting with the tense silence of the office, the blocks scattered among papers representing millions of dollars. "You know, Mrs. Albright," he said, his voice dangerously calm, "I understand investments. I know a high-risk asset from a low-yield one. For the past 2 years, I've invested considerable capital in my son's recovery. Doctors, clinics, world-renowned therapists, and the return on that investment has been zero. In fact, it's been negative. My son's emotional net worth has only decreased. He picked up one of the wooden blocks, feeling its simple texture in his fingers. And then this asset appears. A game that probably costs less than the interest my investments earn in a single minute. And with this asset, for the first time, I saw my son try and fail without crying. I saw him demonstrate persistence. I saw a flicker of something I haven't seen in years: interest. He raised his eyes to the housekeeper, and for the first time she saw something in his face that wasn't the calm authority of her employer, but the fury of a father. You talk to me about discipline, but the discipline you impose is breaking his spirit. You talk to me about undermining authority, but maybe the authority that needs to be undermined is the one that mistakes treatment for punishment. Mrs. Albright went pale, the shock of this reversal leaving her speechless. She had walked in here expecting to cement her position, and instead she felt the ground trembling beneath her feet. Therefore, Richard continued, his voice now cutting, Helena stays. And this game, he gestured to the scattered blocks, will be returned to my son. And you, Mrs. Albright, will make sure that no therapy session, no exercise, no activity prevents him from playing with it whenever he wishes. Is that clear? The question was not a request for clarification. It was an irrevocable order. Mrs. Albright, for the first time in 20 years, felt completely disarmed. She managed only to whisper, "Yes, sir," the words scratching her throat. She turned and left, not with the march of a general, but with the hesitant steps of a defeated soldier. Alone, Richard looked at the wooden blocks. He tried to stack a few, but his own hands, the hands that signed 7-figure checks, were clumsy. The tower fell, and he remembered what Mrs. Albright had said about cheap sentimentality. Maybe that's what this was. But right now, that cheap sentiment seemed to be the only thing of value in his entire vast and useless empire. He picked up the intercom. "Helena, could you come to my office, please?" Helena entered Richard's office, feeling the weight of the charged atmosphere. Mrs. Albright had passed her in the hallway, her face a mask of fury and humiliation, and Helena had braced herself for the worst. She imagined she would be fired, perhaps even reprimanded for her audacity. But when she saw the scene before her, her apprehension turned to surprise. Richard, the billionaire who controlled an empire of business and finance, was sitting in his imposing leather chair, unsuccessfully trying to stack the small wooden blocks. The tower collapsed with every attempt, and on his face was an expression of almost childish frustration. "Sit down, please," he said, without looking up from the blocks. Helena sat in the chair opposite him, an Italian designer piece that likely cost more than her year's rent. The silence stretched on, filled only by the soft click of wood falling on the polished desk. Finally, Richard sighed and pushed the blocks aside. "I owe you an apology," he said, looking her directly in the eye. "I created an environment in this house where rigidity was mistaken for care and pressure was called therapy, and you, with one simple gesture, showed me how blind I've been." Helena didn't know what to say. She had never been in this position, receiving an apology from someone so powerful. "I just wanted him to have a moment of peace, sir," she replied simply. "Peace," Richard repeated, the word sounding foreign in his mouth. "I have vaults of gold, cryptocurrency wallets, stocks that generate dividends while I sleep. I built a fortress of wealth around him, thinking it would protect him. But what he needed wasn't a fortress, it was a sanctuary." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze lost on the panoramic view of the city. "Ever since his mother, ever since she passed, I've buried myself in work. Every new deal closed. Every increase in my net worth was a way to not feel, to not see what was right in front of me. His pain and my own. I turned this house into a clinic and my son into a project to be fixed. In that moment, the chasm between the multi-millionaire and the cleaner seemed to shrink. Helena no longer saw the boss, the man from the Forbes list. She saw a grieving father, as lost as his son. "You only wanted what was best for him," she said, her voice gentle. "The best that money can buy," he corrected with a bitter edge. "But I forgot about the things that are priceless." He then leaned forward again, the energy of the businessman returning to his features. "That is going to change. Mrs. Albright has been given new instructions. Daniel will have the freedom to be himself. And I'd like to ask something of you. I would like you to observe, not as an employee, but as an ally. Help me see what I can't see. Your salary will be adjusted accordingly." Helena was momentarily stunned. This was far beyond her duties. But then she thought of Daniel, of the boy's face illuminated by concentration just before the door had opened. "You don't need to pay me more for that, sir. I'll do it gladly." Richard nodded, a rare glint of gratitude in his eyes. He gathered the wooden blocks, put them back in the box, and held it out to her. "Take this back to him, please." Helena took the box, the cardboard warm from his hands. As she left the office, she felt that something fundamental had shifted. The house, once a silent battlefield, now had two clearly defined sides. On one side was Mrs. Albright, with her ironclad regimen and her belief in the power of discipline. On the other, a desperate father and an intuitive cleaner, united by a tower of wooden blocks. The war wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. Mrs. Albright was not the type to accept defeat easily. She would obey the direct order, but Helena knew the housekeeper would be watching, waiting for a slip-up. A failure that would prove her method was right and that empathy was just a dangerous weakness. The real battle for Daniel's soul was about to begin. The following week transformed the mansion into a territory of tense truces. Mrs. Albright, true to her word, carried out Richard's orders with icy precision. She cancelled the penmanship sessions and rescheduled the piano lessons, deliberately creating a window of free time for Daniel in the afternoon. The same time Helena usually cleaned the bedroom wing. It was an act of passive-aggressive obedience, a way of saying, "Here is what you wanted, now show me the miracle." And at first, no miracle occurred. Daniel, wary of this sudden freedom, barely touched the Jenga set. The box remained in its corner, a monument to his recent humiliation. He spent the afternoons in his room, quiet, as if expecting the door to open at any moment and the old routine to swallow him up again. Helena, for her part, didn't force the issue. She would clean the boys' room, sometimes humming a soft tune, and always, upon finishing, she would rebuild the Jenga tower in the center of the rug before she left. It was an offering, not a demand. Meanwhile, Richard found himself in a different kind of agony. Before, he had occupied himself with the frantic search for a cure, calling specialists, reading scientific papers. Now, he had to do something much harder: wait. He watched his son on the cameras, his heart aching with every afternoon of inaction. He began to doubt himself. Had he made a mistake? Had he undermined the only structure, however flawed, that his son knew? Mrs. Albright seemed to sense his doubt, her daily reports filled with subtle digs. "Daniel spent the afternoon idle, sir. Dr. Evans believes a lack of stimulation can be detrimental to neuroplasticity." Every technical term was a small victory for her, a way of reasserting her value. The pressure on Richard mounted. A major merger deal, one he'd been working on for months, involving a cash flow of hundreds of millions of euros, was in its most critical phase. He needed his mind sharp, focused on numbers and strategies, but his thoughts were constantly pulled back to his son's silent room. The turning point was not a dramatic event, but a moment so small and quiet it almost went unnoticed. It was a Wednesday afternoon. Richard was on a conference call with investors from Tokyo, his face impassive as he negotiated clauses worth a fortune. On the small monitor window, he saw Helena finish cleaning Daniel's room. As always, she knelt and began to assemble the tower. But this time, something was different. Daniel, who had been sitting on the bed pretending to read a book, got up and came closer. He didn't say a word. He just sat on the floor opposite her and picked up a block. Helena said nothing either. They began to build the tower together, in a shared silence, each adding one piece at a time. It was like a slow, focused dance. Richard felt his throat go dry. He lost the thread of what the Japanese investor was saying. His entire universe, with its stock charts, Bitcoin prices, and complex financial instruments, shrank to fit that small scene on the rug. The tower grew, taller than ever before. Then Helena stood, gave a small nod to Daniel, and left the room, leaving him alone with the work they had built together. Daniel looked at the tower for a long time. Then he reached out his hand, the hand that trembled when holding a simple fork, the hand that failed to sign his own name, the hand that was the symbol of all his frustration. Richard leaned toward the screen, his heart hammering against his ribs. He saw his son's hand approach a block at the base of the tower. There was no tremor. There was a concentration so pure and intense it seemed to generate its own force field, stabilizing every muscle, every nerve. His fingers touched the wood, and with a smoothness and precision that defied everything Richard knew about his son's condition, Daniel slid the block out of the tower. The impossible happened. The tower, tall and precarious, did not fall. Richard's business world dissolved into a single pixel. The voice of the investor in Tokyo, discussing a 9-figure cash flow and the profitability of new investments in euros, became a distant, irrelevant hum. Nothing mattered but that image on the screen, his son's steady hand. The boy, his Daniel, had achieved the impossible. Richard felt a wave of relief, so violent it left him breathless, as if he'd been underwater for years and had finally broken the surface. The profit from that merger, the future dividends, the consolidation of his power in the Asian market, it all turned to dust. The greatest asset of his life wasn't on the stock exchange, it was here, in a room upstairs, proving every expert wrong. "Gentlemen!" He cut off the speaker mid-sentence, his voice hoarse. "Something unavoidable has come up. We'll reschedule." He ended the call before they could protest, the click of the mouse sounding like a gavel at an auction where he had just bought back his own soul. He didn't move. He just watched, his heart suspended. Daniel, with the same deliberate slowness, moved his hand to the top of the tower. He placed the wooden block with a reverent softness. The tower swayed for a microsecond and then settled, taller and prouder than before. And then Daniel looked at his own hand. He turned it over, opened and closed his fingers, as if seeing it for the first time. It was no longer a traitor, a source of shame. It was his. And on his face, a smile broke through, not a small, hesitant smile, but a wide, genuine grin that reached his eyes and lit them with a light Richard had feared he would never see again. It was the pure, unadulterated look of victory. Instinctively, Richard saved the video file. He watched it again and again. Each repetition was a confirmation that it hadn't been an illusion. That short 30-second clip was more precious than all the gold in his vaults, more valuable than his entire stock portfolio. He knew he couldn't run to the room. His presence, his excitement, would be a pressure that could break the spell. The miracle had happened in the absence of expectation. He had to honor that. But there was one person he had to see. He stood up, his legs slightly unsteady, and walked out of his office, leaving the charts and tickers behind. He crossed the marble hallways, not as the master of the house, but as a pilgrim seeking a shrine. He found her in the laundry room, a pristine, functional white room in the basement. Helena was facing away from the door, folding bath towels with methodical tranquility. The contrast between the simplicity of the task and the magnitude of what she had set in motion was overwhelming. He stopped at the door, trying to find his voice. "How do you thank someone for giving you back your son?" Words felt inadequate, too small. "Helena," he said, and the name came out as more of a whisper. She turned, unstartled. Her serene eyes met his, and in them he saw not surprise, but a quiet understanding, as if she already knew why he was there. "Mr. Richard." "How?" he managed to ask, the word heavy with the weight of 2 years of despair. "How did you... what did you do?" Helena finished folding the towel in her hands and placed it on the neat stack. Her eyes, which seemed to see past the fortune and the power, rested on his. "He didn't need a therapist to fix him," she said, her voice soft, but with a clarity that cut right through him. "He just needed someone to play with him, someone who didn't care if the tower fell." The devastating simplicity of that truth hit Richard with the force of a wave. Years of specialists, of expensive treatments, of a relentless search for a complex solution, and this was the answer. It was so simple, and he had never seen it. He felt the iron control he maintained over his emotions, the same control he used to dominate boardrooms and billion-dollar negotiations, begin to crumble. A lump formed in his throat, and his eyes, to his utter horror, burned with unshed tears. The great businessman, the multi-millionaire with nerves of steel, was about to fall apart in front of his cleaner. The sight of his own distorted reflection in the stainless steel washing machines was what anchored Richard back to reality. He was Richard Sterling, a name that meant power and control in the financial world. Men like him didn't fall apart. They made acquisitions, they calculated risk, they turned capital into fortunes. But the woman before him didn't seem to see the billionaire. She saw the man behind the facade, and her calm wasn't judgment, but a safe harbor. He swallowed hard, forcing the lump in his throat to dissolve. I saw," he said, his voice still unsteady. "On the cameras. His hand, it was steady." Helena nodded, a small smile touching the corner of her lips. Concentration is a powerful thing. When the mind is focused on the joy of a task, the body sometimes forgets to be afraid. "Afraid," Richard repeated. He had always associated the tremors with a neurological failure, a medical condition. He had never once thought of it as fear. Fear of failing, fear of disappointing, fear of being seen as broken. And who had instilled that fear more than he had, with his obsessive quest for a cure that only reinforced the idea that there was something wrong with the boy? The guilt hit him with physical force, tightening its grip on his chest. "I pushed him too hard. All of us did." "You wanted to help him," Helena said, offering an absolution he didn't feel he deserved. Sometimes the desire to help is so strong, we forget to simply be with them. He was silent for a moment, absorbing the depth of her words. Be with them. When was the last time he had simply been with Daniel, without a goal, without a scheduled therapy, without an evaluation of his progress? He couldn't remember. His presence had always been conditional on a result, on an improvement. His legacy depended on it. But what was he leaving, really? An empire of assets for a son who felt like a liability. At that moment, in the sterile environment of the laundry room, Richard made a decision. It wasn't a business decision based on data and projections, but a visceral one that would redefine his entire portfolio of priorities. He took out his phone, the same device he used to move millions of dollars, and opened his calendar. With a few taps, he cancelled all his meetings for the rest of the week. The merger in Tokyo, the board meeting about a new tech acquisition, the call with his fund manager in Switzerland, all of it erased. In its place, he typed 3 words: "Time with Daniel." "Thank you, Helena," he said, and for the first time, the words came out firm, from a place of newfound clarity. "Thank you for showing me what I refused to see." He turned and walked out, not back to his office, but toward the kitchen. He found Mrs. Albright reviewing menus for the week, her red pen making precise notations. She looked up, surprised to see him there at this time of day. "Sir, Mrs. Albright, please cancel all of Daniel's therapeutic appointments indefinitely." The housekeeper's jaw dropped, her pen hovering over the paper. "But sir, Dr. Sterling is flying in from Munich next week. The travel, the fees, cancel it," Richard repeated, his voice leaving no room for argument, "and ask the chef to prepare lasagna for dinner. It's Daniel's favorite." He didn't wait for a reply. He continued on his way, climbing the stairs, feeling lighter with every step. The empire could wait. The stocks could rise or fall. The real investment of his life was waiting for him at the end of that hallway, and he had just realized he was on the verge of emotional bankruptcy. He stopped in front of Daniel's door, his hand raised to knock, and then he hesitated. What would he say? How do you reconnect after so much emotional distance? Fear, the same emotion that had paralyzed his son's hand, now paralyzed him at the door. What if he went in and, with his mere presence, made the tower fall? Richard's hesitation lasted an eternity, contained in seconds. Every fiber of his being, trained for decisive action and command, railed against this paralysis. He could face down hostile boards and negotiate billion-dollar deals without blinking, but the simple wooden door to his son's room felt like an insurmountable barrier. The fear of getting it wrong, of shattering the fragile peace he had just witnessed, was overwhelming. He took a deep breath, the air feeling heavy and insufficient. He remembered Helena's words. He just needed someone to play with him. It wasn't about performance. It was about presence. With an effort that felt Herculean, he lowered his hand from the doorknob and simply knocked, twice. Gently, a muffled, "Come in," came from inside. Richard opened the door slowly. Daniel was sitting on the floor next to the Jenga tower, which now had a few more blocks missing from its base and added to its peak. He looked up, and upon seeing his father, a flicker of apprehension crossed his face. He instinctively shifted his body as if to shield the tower from an invisible gust of wind. Richard's heart contracted. His son saw him as a threat to his achievement. Instead of striding in and owning the space, as he would in any other room in the world, Richard did something he hadn't done in years. He knelt right there in the doorway, so his eyes were level with Daniel's. That's incredible, son," he said, his voice low, almost reverent. "That's the tallest tower I've ever seen." The praise seemed to disarm Daniel. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly. "Helena helped me start it," he said, as if needing to share the credit. "She's good at this," Richard agreed. Can I get a closer look?" Daniel hesitated for a second, then nodded. Richard entered the room, moving with an exaggerated care, as if walking through a minefield. He didn't sit in the expensive armchair or stand towering over the boy. He sat on the floor, on the other side of the tower, crossing the legs of his designer suit on the soft rug. For a long moment, they just sat in silence, contemplating the precarious structure between them. It was the most comfortable silence Richard had experienced in that house in years. "You know," Richard said, breaking the quiet, "when I was your age, my dad and I used to build things with blocks. Nothing as fancy as this, just scraps of wood he'd cut in his workshop." Daniel looked at him, curiosity overcoming his wariness. He'd never heard his father talk about his grandfather, who had died before he was born. "Yeah?" he asked. "Yeah, we'd build forts, cities. One time, we tried to build a replica of the bridge in our town. It collapsed about 20 times. Richard chuckled at the memory. "My dad never got mad. He'd just say, 'Well, looks like our engineers need a snack break.'" The simple story, a small fragment of his own past, seemed to build an invisible bridge between them, as real as the wooden tower. Daniel smiled, a genuine smile. "Do you want to try?" the boy asked in a burst of generosity. Richard felt his chest swell with an emotion so strong it almost hurt. It was an invitation into his son's world, an offer of trust. "I'd love to," he replied, "but my hands are clumsy with this stuff. I'm afraid I'll knock it all down." He told the truth, exposing his own vulnerability, and in that act, he leveled the playing field between them. "It's okay if it falls," Daniel said, echoing the wisdom Helena had given him. "We just build it again." With that permission, Richard reached out. He felt a slight tremor in his own fingers, a tremor of nerves and emotion. He chose an easy block near the top. His fingers, accustomed to signing documents that sealed the fate of major corporations, felt strange against the simple wood. He pulled the block free, his breath caught in his throat. He placed it on top. The tower wobbled. For a second, Richard and Daniel held their breath together, their eyes locked on the teetering structure, and then it steadied. They looked at each other, and a silent understanding passed between them. They were a team. At that moment, the bedroom door swung open without a knock. Mrs. Albright stood there, her face a storm of astonishment and disapproval at the sight of her billionaire employer sitting on the floor, playing with blocks. "Mr. Richard, what are you doing?" "You have an urgent call from the board in Zurich, on line 2. The intrusion was jarring, a reminder of the world Richard had left behind, the world of pressure, of schedules, of expectations. The tower, as if sensing the shift in the atmosphere, trembled visibly. The sound of Mrs. Albright's voice was like a stone thrown through a pane of glass. The moment of peace and connection shattered instantly. Richard saw Daniel's body go rigid, the look of achievement in his eyes replaced by the old, familiar shadow of fear. The Jenga tower, like a seismograph of the room's tension, swayed dangerously. Daniel's hand, which had been resting loosely on the carpet, clenched into a fist, and a subtle tremor, the ghost of his former affliction, returned to his fingers. Richard's world split in two. On one side was the call from Zurich, the universe he commanded. He knew exactly what that call meant. The final phase of a months-long negotiation, a deal that could add tens of millions of euros to his net worth, cementing his billionaire status on the European stage. It was about profitability, the future of a hedge fund, the pure, intoxicating logic of numbers that had built his fortune. Mrs. Albright stared at him from the doorway, the very personification of that world, efficient, demanding, relentless. Her gaze said it all. "This is your duty. This is how your wealth is maintained. Get back to your post." But on the other side of the chasm was his son, a boy on the floor, looking at the trembling tower with the same panicked expression he once had for a glass of water. Richard realized with painful clarity that Mrs. Albright wasn't just announcing a phone call. She was reasserting a value system, a world where cash flow mattered more than the flow of a conversation between a father and son. She was, unknowingly, testing the sincerity of his transformation. He looked at Daniel's pale face, at the hand that was beginning to vibrate more intensely, and he knew that any profit from that call would be the most expensive liability of his life. He slowly turned his head, not toward the door or his distant office, but to face the housekeeper. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried a weight that silenced the echo of urgency in the hall. "Mrs. Albright," he said, with a calm that was more terrifying than any shout, "the gentlemen in Zurich are very patient men. They can wait." The housekeeper blinked, incredulous. "But sir, it's the board. They were very specific about the urgency, and I am being very specific now," Richard cut in, his voice sharp as steel. "There is nothing in the world more urgent than what I am doing right at this moment. Tell my assistant to reschedule, or better yet, say nothing. Let them wait." Mrs. Albright's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. It was a breach of protocol so fundamental, an inversion of priorities so shocking that her brain, trained by 20 years of service, seemed unable to process it. She, who had always been the guardian of Richard's time and efficiency, was being told that his time now belonged to a game of blocks on the floor. The impact of those words reverberated through the room in silent shockwaves, and it was this tension, this seismic shift in power, that finally sealed the tower's fate. With a collective breath held in the air, a single block, destabilized by the vibration running through the very floorboards, slid free. The entire tower came crashing down with a dry, cascading clatter, the wooden blocks scattering across the rug like bones. In the ensuing silence, one sound stood out, small and desolate, a choked sob from Daniel. Richard whipped his head around. The boy's face was contorted in a pain that went far beyond the game. And then Richard saw it. Daniel's hand, which had been almost perfectly steady, was now shaking uncontrollably. A violent, racking vibration born not of the difficulty of moving a block, but of the trauma of witnessing a battle that should never have been his fight. The clatter of wood on the rug echoed in the quiet room, but it was Daniel's sob that tore through Richard's heart. The tremor in the boy's hand was the worst he had ever seen, a convulsion of frustration and fear that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. He wasn't crying for the fallen tower. He was crying for everything it represented. The brief moment of victory, the hard-won peace, and how quickly it had all been destroyed by the invasion of the outside world, the world of pressure and expectation that Mrs. Albright embodied. In that instant, something inside Richard broke. The businessman's patience, the leader's emotional control, the facade of calm authority, it all disintegrated. He rose to his feet, not with the agility of an athlete, but with the slow, deliberate fury of a force of nature. His eyes, once expressive of a steely calm, now burned with an intensity that made Mrs. Albright take a step back. "Get out," he said. The words were spoken in a low tone, almost a growl. It was not an order, it was an expulsion. Mrs. Albright, still paralyzed by shock, just stared at him. "Sir, I said get out," Richard repeated, taking a step toward her. His presence seemed to fill and overwhelm the room. "Get out of this room and get out of this house. Now." The housekeeper went ashen, the color draining from her face. "Out of the house! Mr. Richard, I've worked for you for 20 years. I helped build this estate. You built nothing." Richard's voice finally exploded, a thunderclap long suppressed. "You just polished the walls of my prison. You turned my home into a hospital and my son into a patient. For 20 years, you valued my assets, but you never understood my greatest treasure." He gestured toward Daniel, who had curled up on the floor, his hands over his ears to block out the noise. "Look at him. This is the result of your discipline, of your order. You don't see a child. You see a failed project. You don't see his suffering. You see a smudge on your reputation for efficiency." Every word was a blow, dismantling the housekeeper's armor of pride and service. Tears began to well in her eyes, tears of shock, of humiliation, of an impotent rage. I only followed the recommendations, what you paid them to do." "And I was wrong," Richard shouted, the confession echoing through the room. "I was wrong to believe that the cure for a broken heart could be bought, that grief could be scheduled and treated in 1-hour sessions. I was so busy building an empire of things that I forgot how to build a human being." He stopped, breathing heavily, his chest heaving. The climax of this silent war was not a physical event, but an emotional explosion that reset all the rules. It was the end of a regime. Mrs. Albright, defeated and disarmed, took a stumbling step backward into the hall. She looked at Richard one last time, not at the employer of 2 decades, but at a stranger, a fierce father protecting his young. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her once firm and authoritative steps now the hurried retreat of an exile. Richard stood there, trembling with the adrenaline of the confrontation. He felt exhausted, emptied, but also strangely light. The easiest decision of his life, as he would later describe it, had been the hardest to execute. He turned to his son. Daniel was looking up at him with wide eyes, his hand still trembling, but the fear in his face was mixed with something new, awe. He had just watched his distant, controlled father move a mountain for him. Slowly, Richard returned to the floor and sat amidst the scattered blocks. He didn't try to touch them. He didn't try to touch Daniel. He just sat there, present, sharing the same hurt, the same space. He picked up a single wooden block, holding it in his palm. "I'm so sorry, Daniel," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I'm sorry I let the pressure get to you. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand." He looked at the block strewn across the floor, a perfect symbol of his crumbled world. "But you know what?" he continued, his voice gaining a new firmness, a new hope. "The best part about a tower that falls is that we get to build it again, together, our way." He held the block out to his son. It wasn't an order, nor was it therapy. It was an invitation. Richard's invitation hung in the air, embodied in the small wooden block he offered. Daniel looked from his father's hand to his face. The fury that had frightened him was gone, replaced by something he barely recognized, a raw vulnerability, a silent plea for forgiveness. Slowly, as if afraid a sudden move might break the spell, Daniel reached out his own hand. The tremor was still there, a muscle memory of anguish, but it was different, an echo, a seismograph recording the end of an earthquake. His fingers touched his father's as he took the block. The contact was warm, an electric current of pardon and promise, and the instant he held the wood, the tremor subsided, subdued by the strength of their new pact. They began to rebuild. There was no hurry, no goal of height. It was a meditative act. They placed one block, then another, in a silence that was more eloquent than any conversation. When a piece fell, they would look at each other, and sometimes a small smile would surface. Then they would simply start again. The fall had lost its power to terrorize. In the days that followed, the mansion transformed. The oppressive silence was replaced by a peaceful quiet. Without Mrs. Albright and her ironclad schedule, time seemed to stretch, filled not with therapies, but with life. Richard cancelled his trip to Munich and indefinitely postponed the merger in Tokyo. To the astonishment of his partners, he announced he would be working from home. His vast office, once an impenetrable sanctum, now kept its door open. Daniel would wander in and out, sometimes just to watch his father, other times to show him a drawing. Richard taught his son how the colored lines on a stock chart went up and down, not as a lesson in business, but as a game of roller coasters. He realized that the profitability of his entire net worth couldn't buy a single moment of Daniel's easy laughter. The boy's healing, now visible and exponential, exposed the depth of Richard's own sickness, the loneliness of a man who had used his fortune as a shield against grief. It was one evening, as he watched Daniel sleep, his face serene, his hands relaxed on the blanket, that he understood the healing wasn't yet complete. His own had barely begun. The next morning, he found Helena in the kitchen, making coffee before starting her duties. Her presence in the house was no longer merely functional. It was the center of gravity for the new peace they all felt. He poured a cup for himself and one for her, a gesture that broke years of employer-employee protocol. "Helena," he began, "I can never thank you enough." She just smiled, a smile that said thanks weren't necessary. "I wanted to ask about you," he continued, sitting at the table. "You talk so little about your life." And just like that, the chasm closed. She told him about her grown son, a mechanic who was proud of his steady, grease-stained hands. She spoke of her late husband, a simple man who left her not an inheritance of money, but a legacy of laughter and kindness. Richard, in turn, spoke of Laura, his wife. He told her how her brightness had filled every corner of this immense house, and how, after she was gone, he had tried to fill the emptiness with things. Art, deals, an empire of assets that only left him more of a liability in the face of his own pain. They were no longer the multimillionaire and the cleaner. They were just a man and a woman, sharing the universal truths of loss, love, and hope. That afternoon, from the same office where he once watched his son suffering, Richard looked out at the garden. The afternoon sun gilded the lawn. Helena and Daniel were there, planting small flower seedlings she had brought. Daniel's hands, steady and confident, plunged into the soil. He looked up at Helena and laughed, a pure sound that the wind carried up to Richard's window. In that moment, the final revelation struck him. Helena hadn't just healed his son. She had shown him how to rebuild a home from the ruins. He, the man who thought power lay in controlling everything, discovered that true strength was in surrendering to the simple, overwhelming need for human connection. He stood up, his heart beating with a new, clear resolution. He walked out of his office, not with the hurry of an executive, but with the purpose of a man who finally knows where he is going. He descended the stairs and walked toward the glass door to the garden, his destination no longer on a distant continent, but just a few feet away, under the afternoon sun. The garden, once a pristine and untouched set piece, was now alive. Small mounds of fresh earth marked the place of the new flowers, and the sound of Daniel's laughter mingled with the rustling of leaves. Richard paused at the glass door, watching the scene. Daniel showed Helena an earthworm he'd found, the joy on his face more radiant than any diamond Richard had ever owned. This was no longer the ghost child who haunted the hallways, but a boy in his natural habitat, discovery and play. The empire of marble and glass behind him felt cold and meaningless compared to the warmth of that small moment. He slid the door open, and the smell of grass and damp earth enveloped him. Helena looked up and smiled as he approached. Daniel ran to him. "Dad, look, we're making a garden for Mom. Helena said she'll love the flowers." The blow of grief and love that hit Richard was so intense he had to steady himself on his son's small shoulder. He looked at Helena, and in her serene eyes was a deep understanding. She wasn't trying to replace anyone. She was helping to build bridges to memory, turning pain into beauty. "I'm sure she will," Richard said, his voice thick. That afternoon, the billionaire Richard Sterling knelt on the grass. He got dirt on his expensive suit, digging holes for the seedlings with his own hands. He laughed when Daniel sprayed him with the hose. He felt the sun on his face and realized it had been years since he'd stopped to feel something so simple. The cash flow, the stocks, the compounding interest of his vast treasury, none of it mattered. The only investment with infinite returns was this: time. Later, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Daniel ran inside to test out a new video game his father, in an act of total capitulation to childhood, had bought him. Richard and Helena were left alone, sitting side by side on a garden bench, watching the colors fade. "He adores you," Richard said quietly. "He's an easy boy to love," Helena replied. A comfortable silence settled between them. Richard thought about the journey of the past month. It felt like a lifetime. He had started as a king in an empty castle, ruling an empire that couldn't give him what he needed most. Now, he felt like just a man, sitting in a garden, next to a woman who had rebuilt his world with the patience of someone building a tower, block by block.